today we are talking about marginalized groups and how data exposure affects their life and work. I'm Erin Kapczynski from OneRep, and we have with us Elisa Stampf, founder and CEO of Insure Equality. Elisa, welcome.
Thanks so much, Erin. It's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about Insure Equality and what made you start it.
Absolutely. So Insure Equality is a 501c3 nonprofit that's dedicated to making insurance a more welcoming place. And you probably have some image of what insurance is like in your mind. Most of us that don't spend time in the industry can picture somebody playing golf or somebody, walking to the bank laughing with their money. But insurance goes deep. I mean, these are some of the images I hear from folks. But insurance is a much bigger industry than that with a lot going on. And as a millennial, when I graduated and walked into the workforce, one of the things that I was often told was, hey, you know what? We fix discrimination, especially sexism. You should be able to make your way up to the top of the ladder. No problem. Everything is fine. And when I got into the industry, I was often smacked in the face with it and the reality that we hadn't really solved it. And I took my hits on the chin, and many of us did, but it wasn't big enough that it caused me to do anything. And most of the time, I found myself comparing my situation to somebody else's, saying, well, it's not as bad as hers, or it's not as bad as theirs, so I'll be okay. And I think as women, we often get stuck in that loop. But what really pushed me or propelled me in this direction was an incident after 2020. And I don't have to tell you what 2020 made us do to our lives to reevaluate the way that we were thinking about things. But it made me go, how can I be in my community more? I'd spent most of my time on the carrier side of the industry, and I decided to move into the agency side. And within 4 months of that move, I was experiencing extreme harassment and discrimination. And it was awful. I remember thinking to myself, what did I do to deserve this? How did I bring this on myself? Really evaluating every single choice. And it wasn't until I sat in a Zoom room, because it was the pandemic in the midst of it. And I was surrounded by a bunch of other women in the industry, and they asked what was going on. And Erin, I think any other day, I probably would have said, I'm fine. Everything's fine. Let me push it to the side. But that day I was feeling a little brave. And maybe it was the way that she asked, or maybe it was the way that they made space. But I shared. I talked about my experience. I talked about the discrimination and the harassment that I was facing. And instead of these women coming back to me going, well, what did you do to make this happen to yourself? Instead of the shame and the spiraling that I was bringing on myself or that I thought would occur, every single woman in that room went around and told her story, or her mother's story, or her sister's story, or someone else that they knew, their coworker. And that's when I knew this problem was deeper than just me. And so I worked with a bunch of people. I created a group of about 5. We got a board of 12, and we launched a nonprofit in 6 months.
Amazing. Well, what a powerful story. And I think it speaks to just any woman out there, or if you know anyone, if you're not a woman and you know any women, this is essentially what we've experienced and continue to experience. I know from myself, technology, the tech industry and the media industry, those are my stomping grounds. And as we know, tech is pretty much up there with potentially being behind. So we'll talk about this a little bit later in the DEI space. And, it got to the point where I was the only female executive in the room, and I felt constantly left out of conversations because I didn't play golf. And I learned to play golf, right? So it's such a choice that we make. Do we play that game and get heard, or do we put our foot down, decide that this is bullshit, we're not playing, but then we're left behind? And it sounds like that's sort of what you were grappling with before that day happened.
Absolutely. And can we stay with golf for a second? I love that you brought it up. I'm serious.
Speaking of golf, I learned it for work just so I could have my just so I could get the budget I need to do the work that I need.
You're absolutely right. And it's something that impacted me as well. That's why I said, let's stick with it. Because I remember when I first became a marketing rep, which is a sales rep for an insurance company. So think pharmaceutical rep. We represent one company and we go into an agency and we talk about it. Golf is definitely the language of business in insurance. And my boss at the time was an avid golfer.
And tech as well, and media,
tech,
and manufacturing. And yes. Please go
so
on.
You get where we're going.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember talking to my boss, who was an avid golfer, and I said, Mr. Boss, I would love to, take golf lessons so I can be on the course and I can learn and I can, do some deals. And he goes, maybe you should learn the job a little bit more, take some time before you do it. Granted, I had been an underwriter for 4 years at this point, which is a lot of experience walking into, and you don't have to have underwriting experience to go into the sales portion of it. But I said, okay, I get it. At the end of the day, a colleague of mine who started after I did, had less time in the industry, came up to me and he goes, hey, Mr. Boss told me I should get golf lessons. Are you going to take some too? The same day. So it's very obvious who was playing whom. And I have one more golf story and then we can move on from it, because I think it's so important how people use different mechanisms to either exclude people or keep people from the conversation. There was an executive in the insurance industry that I was talking to about our pledge, because we have a pledge that companies can sign to say we care about people more than profit. That's essentially what it says. And she was one of 13 executives, the only woman. And she goes, Alyssa, I want to sign it, but I would have to convince 12 men to do it. And she goes, they won't even take me to the golf outing that happens every Thursday. Every other executive goes but me, and I know how to play golf.
Okay. So that is marginally worse, because at least, once I learned how to play, I was definitely included. So kudos to my team, I suppose.
We could take that a lot further, I think.
Yeah.
But I think your comment about what we have to learn to try to fit in, to force ourselves into a small area, isn't serving all of us. It's not even serving the populations that enjoy golf, because they're missing out on conversations with you, with me, with this executive that really wanted to be there.
So true. Absolutely. So obviously these things that we're talking about, they're so cultural, they're systemic, they are in so many workplaces, so many industries. But what we want to talk about today is even a little bit more overt, and potentially some of the a little bit of what can stem from this type of culture and allowance of this, and that is some of the issues that can present as more dire and potentially more dangerous. And we're talking about issues certain groups face. So the groups we're talking about, definitely not an exhaustive list, but for anchoring purposes, it's people living with disabilities, minority and ethnic groups, certainly, LGBTQ plus individuals, women, which I feel like it's crazy still to include women in this list. But in terms of online safety, which is our topic today, women actually were polled in a pretty large study. And as far as their sentiment and how safe they feel online, women said 37% of women said they feel safe online versus 49% of men who say they feel safe online. So even there's that disparity. And some of the issues that we're talking about that, aside from some of the cultural issues that are much explored all over the media and personal discourse, public discourse, certainly. But we're talking about things like direct discrimination. We're talking about personal attacks that maybe start at work and then end in your home. We're talking about workplace harassment. We're talking about online harassment in your home even. We actually, one rep, we obviously play in the space of removing personal information from the internet. And a lot of the businesses that sign on with us actually do it to protect not only their vulnerable groups, but the fact that the work that their teams do are directly related to kind of being exposed to the general public. We're talking about, all kinds of harassment. We're talking about doxxing even. And I know that you have a take on that in terms of some of the communities that you deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. So our entire executive team at InsureEquality is queer, and we have trans teammates. And trans rights have been in the news a lot, in the media a lot, and it's something that's highly important to us. It's one of the reasons we started talking to One Rep, because it's not just about finding an address and worrying about doxing, as you were mentioning. It's also about dead naming. And our teammates have talked to us at length about the fears they have of employers Google searching them and finding out their dead name and using that to prevent them from finding work. And it happens. It happens all the time. And so not to, sound dramatic, but to underscore exactly what you're saying, these are folks' lives, their livelihoods, and having information publicly available that somebody doesn't want publicly available. It's important to be able to have the access that One Rep creates to be able to remove that.
Yeah, and it's also, so let's chat for a second about that. You're speaking about information somebody does not want on the internet, and you gave some examples: dead naming, certainly email, other information that can so easily be found. And that, of course, as we know, affects underrepresented groups, but potentially more. But it really can affect just about anyone. And at One Rep, the way we like to think about online information, online personal information, is whether it was authorized or not. So did you opt into having that kind of information publicly available about you? For examples of information or data found on you that you did opt into can be like your social media profiles. You created those yourself, your email accounts, anything that you filled out, like you gave information to a store, like, for example, you consumed an ad, that type of stuff, things that you agree to do. That is information you opted into. What we actually address at One Rep, and I think it's kind of an interesting distinction, specifically related to what you're talking about, is there is data on individuals that people may not even be aware that's out there on them. And that is the scary part. And it is very, very difficult to remove, which is actually how One Rep started, is removing that data on behalf of people. But just a quick diversion, how does that data even get onto the internet in the first place? You didn't put it there, as we just established, that you don't want it there. You may not even know that it's there. And really, it happens when you just go on, you live your life, you open a bank account, you buy a house, you sign up for like a sweepstake, you win a prize, you get a professional license, all these kinds of things that we do on a regular basis. And those actions are really turned into data sources. And there's an entire data economy out there on the internet that most people don't even know exists. That information is all turned into data sources. And then there are these huge data aggregators. A lot of them are really legitimate companies, like the credit bureaus, for example, very legitimate. I mean, you can't buy a house or a car without the lender checking your credit. And like Experian, TransUnion, those kinds of things, they are actually a very large data aggregator that then turns around and they provide information to what is known as people search websites or people finder websites. And they're sites, they don't have really their own information. They pull from large data brokers and they package it in a way that makes it very attractive for Google to pick up and index. And they actually incentivize that transaction. And so what this means for us as individuals, or what this means for an employer, because this is your team members, is that then all sorts of data, your contact information, your phone number, your email, your home address, your, actually your date of birth. So ageism, hello, for employment. Mm-hmm. How you voted is actually available out there on these kinds of websites, your political affiliations, who you're related to. So if somebody wants to take action against you, they're like, well, I couldn't get to Elisa, so let's see who Elisa is related to or who she's associated with. So those kinds of things are all available, and none of us opted into them. So I do think it's important to make that distinction.
No, thank you for doing that, because if you weren't going to mention that, I was absolutely going to say that your data is currency.
Yes.
And we see it being traded all the time. I mean, insurance companies have a lot of it. There's a company that I sat on a panel with last year that talked about they have petabytes of data. And it allows them to make marketing decisions, sales decisions, actuarial decisions. And while some of the intent with that is really good, to your point, what it does is it puts or exposes a lot of information that some people don't want available. And I remember before I got my OneRep profile, going and trying to remove my name from a lot of these sources. And the amount of time it was taking was a lot. But even beyond that, sometimes it was either difficult or impossible to find the entry point to unpack that or to block it. It became a multi-step process, and it was exhausting.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's why services like ours are so popular, and they're becoming more and more popular. In fact, so some very large carriers are starting to kind of white label some solutions like ours. I mean, like Discover Card, Experian that I mentioned, they have this type of thing. And so many others, I suspect we're going to see even more of it because, funny enough, the pandemic, which you also touched on, really what it did is it amplified the sheer volumes of data because everything went digital. That's how we were able to live and carry on and be social and do our work. And so that actually did a great service to the people search sites in the amount of information and the signals that we allowed to be out there that they can then pick up and package and give to Google, and then Google can display to anyone.
Yeah, it is. It's wild to think about because it's not something that we talk about very often, but you touch on the pandemic. The other part of it is we were all home.
Yeah.
And so folks that maybe were used to being out at the office or maybe had a job that didn't sit them in front of a desk and didn't have a job any longer were at their computer. We were all in that mode and in that mindset. And some terrible stuff happened over that pandemic because of the data that was available to certain folks online.
No, absolutely. That is so true. And what are your thoughts on just the root causes of why some of these attacks and some of this harassment and discrimination, why does that happen? And what does that have to do with data exposure?
Oh my goodness. We do not have the time to go completely deep into that question. But what I will say is this. I think we're at a point in our nation and in our economy where people are struggling. And so I don't think everything that happened was nefarious. But I think when people are struggling, when they're left in scarcity or they don't have an opportunity to get ahead, it becomes an opportunity, is what it does. But aside from that, It's not that we didn't have a lot of political angst going on as well, a lot of social media angst going on as well. I have a personal story that I know you and I have touched on that I feel important to bring up right now, because while it happened, decades ago when I was very young, I think it's still relevant, and it was still happening during the pandemic. In fact, it was happening en masse, and that's domestic violence. When I was a young girl, I grew up in an abusive household. My abuser was my father, and he abused myself, my mother, and my siblings. And so we were able to get away, and we went to a safe house, which was great. We were there with other women and children, and the address was protected. It wasn't posted online, but the issue was he could follow people to get there. To your point about who are you related to? Who can you find to get to the person that you want to get to? And while he wasn't able to do a Google search, because this was before then, he was still able to get to us, and he still found us, and then we had to move. That process, that moment becomes so much more accessible to somebody when they can search for something online.
Oh, it's so incredibly true. It gave me goosebumps. There is now this great organization called the Address Confidentiality Program, ACP, and they're part of, there are about maybe 30 states or so that are doing this, and it's exactly for this purpose. And it's so unfortunate that I don't believe they were around back when you really needed them, but they also, they're using services like ours, some of the different states, to further that protection, right? Because domestic violence victims, the last thing they need is for their abuser to know where they live. And there's only so much that you can do. And, the wider protection of just removing as much as information as you can from the internet is, that makes a lot of sense to sort of do that. So as far as, these are obviously deeply personal stories, and workers, employees, they're all people and sometimes it's so easy to forget that. Though I do love the fact that the trends in the workplace are increasingly potentially being, pushed by the newer generations, millennials, Gen Zs, because the tolerance is becoming low for employers who do not see them as individuals for who they are, whose values don't align with theirs. And a lot of the time, their values are recognize me as an individual. And for these groups that we're talking about, that is so much a part of who they are as an individual. So what can employers do to protect, I want to say to protect these groups, but it's really at the end of the day, it protects, so many people have different issues, even if they don't fall squarely into some of these groups you're talking about, people living with disabilities, minorities, ethnic groups, LGBTQ individuals. What can employers do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, especially because you hit on intersectionality, which is great. Just because you fit into one group doesn't mean that you don't have privilege elsewhere. Just because you have privilege somewhere doesn't mean that there's not a piece of you that still needs protection. And I love that you paused about protecting, because it's really not about that. To your point, it's about recognizing individuality and authenticity. And if employers are asking us to bring our whole selves to work, we want the whole self to be recognized, right? So this is going to sound trite, but honestly, the biggest and the best things employers can do right now is to listen, to ask and to listen. Because what I'm seeing en masse and by and large, when we talk to our community, when we field questions, when we have people write into us, it's not that employers aren't buying the service or they're not giving them the benefit. It has so much more to do with employees are saying, this is what I need. And employers are like, no, you don't need that. You need this. And I think something like what one rep is doing is very unique. It's not a common benefit that you see. I think that's something that a lot of people would clamor for, especially certain groups, as we've mentioned. But a lot of it comes down to if you're going to say to an employee, I want you to bring your whole self here, then you need to listen to what that whole self means. Because if you're going to say you have to fit into this box, then you can't get the full employee.
That's an incredibly valuable point. And so to expand that a little bit further, obviously your personal experience and your is drawn from the insurance industry. But I do have to say, I'm bringing this back to, to
You should.
my
It all
favorite
intersects.
industry. Yeah.
Yes.
So tech industry tops, just about which industries are falling behind in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, or making them less diverse industries. So tech's certainly not a surprise to anyone, especially those of us who worked in it. They top those lists. Also STEM, very much so. Healthcare.
Yeah.
Healthcare is a big one. Finance, law, on list. Construction, manufacturing, also probably not a huge surprise. Armed forces and professional sports. So those are just some of the ones that, and funny enough, even though you obviously can speak to otherwise, and you have an entire awesome, mission-driven business to say otherwise, but insurance didn't even make, like this list, which clearly it should be on. So from your experience at Insure Equality and your personal walks up until then, what can you share what you've learned that other industries can adopt or take advantage of?
Absolutely. And I will pause here because oftentimes insurance doesn't get its own byline. Yeah. Typically, we're lumped into finance.
So, that's what it is. So you're 1, 2, 3.
We're
you're
in
number
there.
5. Yeah. You're number 5
we're
on
in
this
the
list.
We're definitely in the list. When people think finance, they typically think banking. They don't think of insurance. And I think that's by design. The other thing I'd point out about that list that you just rattled off was many of those industries are wealth generating industries. And I don't think that's a surprise either. Before I go into what I think other industries can learn from what we're learning, I want to remark on something that I learned recently. And that is there was a report done by Mercer last year. They surveyed 2,600 HR professionals. And they asked a whole bunch of questions. What are you worried about? What are you seeing? What do you think we should be focusing on? And one of the largest numbers by far in that whole survey had to do with mental health and safety. And it was 86% of that 2,600 that was surveyed said that that is their primary concern. That includes mental health, that includes burnout, that includes DEI initiatives, it includes feeling safe at work. So I want to hit on that wholly because that's where your employees' heads are at. They're worried about their livelihood, if they can get their kids to school, if their kids will survive school, because we've had a few things going on there. There's a lot that has gone on in our lives in the past few years. But in terms of what we've learned, because we have a culture rating system that we allow employees in the industry to use, and they talk about what they need from a cultural standpoint, and we've been able to glean some data from that. And there's a couple points that rise to the top for me. And one of the top ones is the size of your company doesn't matter in terms of belonging. I think oftentimes we're associating, maybe it's a tight-knit group, and that's when you really feel like you belong. That doesn't seem to matter. You could work for a giant corporation and still feel like you belong if the right mechanisms are in place. Another thing that really pops out for me is teams can have and feel very different from the organization as a whole. So that whole adage of a rotten apple spoils the bunch can be very true, but a good apple can stand alone outside of that as well. So in terms of adoption, in terms of what you can do to make your employees feel seen, feel heard, it's start with you. Start with the individual. I think we tend to look at DEI and B and inclusion and all of these mechanisms from a zoomed out view, thinking, well, the powers that be have to make changes so that it can trickle down. But the reality is, and we've talked about culture and we've touched on it here and there, every person impacts culture. every person contributes to and actively works within culture. It's what door you use to walk in if there's three and everybody goes in the left one. It is who puts on the coffee pot in the morning. It's if you can say that you've made a mistake verbally. All of these little pieces contribute to it. So if there's anything that I hope employers adopt, it is this mindset that every employee has an impact on the culture, and therefore every employee's voice matters in terms of the conversation.
Wow. Wouldn't that be an incredibly amazing world if we could just broadcast this message to absolutely every company?
We can hope. We're certainly working on it, and we're certainly trying. I know
You
it's
certainly
like,
are.
here's the thing. I'm a millennial, and I know that when I say that, there's people that go, oh, you're idealistic. You're not living in the real world. You don't understand how it works. And here's the thing. Like, I'm a millennial that's in her mid to late 30s that has been in the workforce in corporate America for 2 decades. I impacted the culture wherever I was, and so did my teammates. It's not idealistic to think that people can stand up and show up and contribute in a meaningful way, because we all do right now. We just don't feel empowered to say that we do.
That's so true. I understand, because I myself have worked in quite a few places, and that rotten apple analogy was so what I found to be very, very true was certain functional areas operated on their own kind of microcosm, in their own microculture, and then which all rolled up to, the executive team. And I've worked with, multi-billion-dollar industries. I've worked with tiny little startups, and it's the same across the board. Just the bigger the company, you just have more of these microcosm of cultures.
Yeah, no, you're so right. You're so right. And all of that can contribute and feed off of each other and impact each other. But yeah, we have to stop thinking that, big companies are one way and small companies are another. We're all people. We're all people operating and working in the world.
That's so true. And sort of to the topic at hand, and employers, not only do they feel like owe their employees the voice and to really see them, but they owe them to provide a safe work environment as well, so where an employee doesn't fear for their safety based on the kind of work they do, if they deal with the public, or they have coworkers with certain belief systems that don't match their own. Just to feel safe, physically safe, emotionally safe in the workplace is, I think, a big onus on the employer.
Absolutely. I mean, we think about insurance, right? I'm an insurance nerd. We can get into it. If you go to a restaurant and that restaurant isn't safe, if you slip and fall or you eat something in the food, you can sue that restaurant, right? Why is, there's a disconnect between how we're thinking about employers sometimes and how we're thinking about the public space. But to your point about providing that safe space, there was a conversation that we had right before we started this where we talked about a story that I've told before about being a marketing rep in insurance and doing this handoff conversation. And I think this is a good time to talk about that. I'll keep it brief. But essentially, in insurance, we recognize that there weren't safe environments. We recognize that there were unsafe vendors or partners that we worked with or people that were considered problematic. Unfortunately, and in many cases, if that agent had been working with the company for many years or made the company a lot of money, it was known, but it was kind of pushed to the side. So instead of addressing it, instead of owning that, what often happened was that the people that worked with those agencies would have conversations to survive working with that agency. And it typically went something like, I would be handing it off to another employee and going, okay, so don't wear skirts or dresses in this office because you will be harassed. Go to Alice, not Hank, if you want to get something done. And you would have the business conversation in there too. But knowing what we had all experienced, we found the onus on ourselves to protect ourselves and the people that came after us. And to your point, that shouldn't be on an employee. That should be on the employer.
Absolutely. And I think we all, just as women in general, I know I have quite a few stories to share along those lines, along my journey. And if you ever find yourself in the LA area, come on over, let's have a drink, and we can share all of these stories. I'm sure there's going to be quite a few colorful scenarios that come out of this. But it's been such a pleasure and such a joy to talk to you. And do you have parting thoughts that we should consider before we sign off?
The only thing I think I would say is the solutions that we're seeking are not out there in terms of expense, are not out there in terms of implementation. It's not this big fish that we're trying to catch that we can't find. It comes down to human interaction, human relationships, and connection with each other. It's really that simple. And the minute we can sit down and talk to each other and have conversations like this one, Erin, which again, thank you for having me, I think that's how we start to turn the tide.
Love it. Thanks so much. It's been, again, a pleasure and an honor, and I'm sure we'll touch base soon.
Thank you. Definitely.